Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Syria. My name is Matthew Hughes, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. We're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan, apolitical, nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. IRC members are warmly invited to join one or more IRC roundtables, a chance to connect with other members, talk about current events and regions of interest to you, and help inform IRC programming. Roundtable members will be invited to a quarterly meeting and receive IRC event information and other updates relevant to the regions they select. Please learn more at irckc.org. With so much going on right now, it's easy to lose track of what's happening around the world, especially in places that have fallen out of the headlines or where news stories are increasingly complicated. We can't predict the future, but we do know the importance of understanding historical background and current global context. No matter your level of expertise, the What's Happening series will offer meaningful explorations on some particularly active parts of the globe. We invite you to deepen your global knowledge and nuance your understanding of what's happening around the world today as we explore what's happening in Syria. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Is Dr. Michael McCary. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Central Missouri. His research focuses on politics and authoritarian regimes and civil military relations with a regional focus on the Middle East. Dr. McCary worked in Jordan for over 2 years as a research fellow with both Fulbright in the American Center of Oriental Research. He's also an active member of the IRC's Board of Directors. Mike, thanks so much for being with us, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the kind introduction, and welcome to you all to our discussion this evening. As the name of this program series suggests, there's a lot going on in the world and a lot of newsworthy events that capture our attention every day. I know, for example, that we've all been glued to our various screens trying to make sense of what's going on in Ukraine over the past week. But let's not overlook Syria's civil war, which, far from being a thing of the past, is ever evolving and continues to this day. While it might have fallen out of the headlines, there are all sorts of questions that we can explore as we try to wrap our minds around what Syria looks like in 2022. What are the key developments taking place in Syria today? How has the landscape of actors shifted? What do we need to know to understand the Syrian civil war in 2022? Joining us this evening to offer some insight on these questions is Frank Klimas. He is a U.S. Air Force officer and assistant professor in the Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operations at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, where he educates and develops leaders for unified land operations in a complex global operational environment. He's also an expert on the Middle East and North Africa, having served in the U.S. Embassy in Morocco and elsewhere throughout the region. Certainly, he is well placed to help us navigate the complex political and security situation that exists in Syria to this day. In just a minute, I'll turn the floor over to Frank for some initial remarks. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone in attendance that there will be an opportunity for Q&A later on in the event. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I promise we'll get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I'd love to turn the floor over to Frank Klimas. Frank, please take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight, and I want to also thank the IRC for hosting this event and bringing the world a little bit closer together to address these big issues. First, I just some boilerplate. I just want to let you know that although I am an active duty Air Force officer, These views are my own and do not reflect the views of the United States Air Force or the United States Army or the Command and General Staff College of Fort Leavenworth. All right, so let's just get going. So we had for this discussion a opportunity to examine contemporary Syria through the news. And I think that that is probably, for most consumers, the best way to sort of step into the problem. Rather than get into a long discussion about Syria and its importance in the world, I think let's look at it from the other way around and let's look at Syria today and find out how it got that way. I think the preeminent thing most people know about Syria right now is the Syrian civil war. There are a few other major topics, of course, the rise of ISIS, and there's some news some breaking news just this last month regarding ISIS. And to many people, that's actually a surprise that they're still alive and kicking. And additionally, we'll talk about some regional actors that are in Syria and why it continues to be a problem. In fact, represents a foremost issue within the Middle East region. So just to give you a little background on the actual location, Syria itself is a country of about 17.5 million from the 2020 census. And its size, if you wanted to compare it to the United States, it's actually about the size of the state of Georgia. As a result, its neighbors are much larger. For instance, Iraq has about 40 million people. And if you want to compare that to the other news that we hear about the Middle East, in Afghanistan, that's about 39, 40 million as well. So size-wise, they are actually a smaller country. However, they are located in a very important geopolitical location. I just want to show you a couple slides here. And if you could see right here on this slide, we have a location in Syria right here in the middle. And you can see its neighbors are much larger. It sits quite geostrategically right there in the Eastern Med. And that actually leads to some of its importance to a lot of international actors and great powers throughout the last several hundred years. Let me just go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, so I picked 5 articles to sort of highlight some of the foremost problems to get into. And then the first is this article from Foreign Affairs written by Mona Yakubian about Assad is here to stay. Now, if you have been a Syria watcher for the past decade, you would know a lot of these details and to see how they progressed. I just don't want to miss an opportunity to mention that March is coming, actually this month now, marks the 21 years of the Syrian civil war. This article pointed to the current state of Assad going from pariah, international outcast, and then reintroducing Assad back into normalized relations with the Arab partners. It's just starting now in a way that his neighbors are trying to bring him in from the cold. And in here, I tried to capture some of the economic factors, political decisions as well. But to bring it up to speed on this article, and then we'll go through and we'll discuss some of the themes in it a little later. If you just a quick thumbnail about really the cause of the civil war. Largely, if you remember back in 2011, at the end of 2010, in Tunisia, there was an uproar. There was a quiet revolution that started, and then later in the beginning of 2011, this flourished into the Arab Spring, which gave an important political voice to the unrepresented Arab populations in the Middle East. There's not just one Arab Spring. It looked and felt and was manifested in different ways in every country. And that leads me to a side note about the Middle East broadly, which is I don't think that for those of you who are here, you're interested in the Middle East or you're interested in Syria. it would be it would be cheating the entire region by addressing it as one place with one set of problems. And we look, the Middle East is not a homogenous group of people with the same economies and the same beliefs and the same governments. There are similarities, but these challenges are unique to every country. And that's, in a nutshell, what we saw occur with the Arab Spring, which of course started in Tunisia and spread, through Egypt. Of course, Mohamed Morsi was deposed, and then we had some transitional governments, through the years. And that was in several other countries as well. It was very tepid in some places like Oman or Morocco, and of course, very influential in Syria. So in March of 2011, the Arab Spring is spreading throughout the region, and some seventh grade boys, 13 and 14-year-olds, decide to paint some graffiti on the wall of their school that was critical to Assad regime. And it was basically something like, "You're next, Dr. Assad." That graffiti, in essence, launched the Arab Spring. What happened was those boys were immediately arrested by the police, and they were imprisoned and tortured for 45 days. One of the boys, there were 15 boys, one of the boys who was 13 died while in captivity. The word from their parents spread to the communities, and that's what began the demonstrations and the public outcry to return the children. As a result, after the release of the children and if the news that there's a death, there are even more public outcasts and outcries. What started in one section of Syria in the west spread to all the major population centers from the south to the north, all along the coast. And that is really the beginning of the revolution. What continued on was Assad's inability to control the message, being able to placate his people, or to actually find a political solution to the problem. As a result, the conflict grew into this now long protracted 11-year war. So let's talk about why that is such a why that war has so much staying power. As we look backwards, we have to look at Bashar al-Assad himself. Now, the Assad family has been in the ruling party or the ruling family of Syria for about 50 years. He was elected in 2000. He essentially obtained power from his father, who died in 1999. And he was elected in an election, but essentially he was the heir apparent, or he was the next in line. But he wasn't really the initial choice. His brother was actually the heir apparent, and he unfortunately died in 1996 while Assad was practicing medicine. He graduated in 1988 from university and went to London to study medicine. And that's why one of his handles is Dr. Assad. Upon the death of his brother, he had to sort of take up the family business. And as we can see through the successive 10, 11 years, was really not up to the job. He was not groomed to lead. He has shown himself to be an entirely weak leader, unable to solve many of the problems that, whether they're economic or they're labor shortage or it's conflict, a military conflict. Bashar al-Assad is not as capable as his father was, Hafiz al-Assad, nor does he have the vision to take Syria into a direction that will allow it to flourish or transform in any way. I think at best he's probably holding on to power like damage control of a sinking ship. A couple of things that exacerbated the Arab Spring were there was a drought 2007 to 2010, which created a urbanization. See, Syria is actually a very agricultural country, there's a lot of arable land. It's not terribly great, though. It's not very, very fertile. So agriculture has been a strong problem. But starting in the 1970s and on, the population started to urbanize and leave the rural areas, thus creating a problem in the largest sector in the Syrian economy, which was agriculture. As a result, fewer hands on the farm, less output, and less, not only less productivity, but less quality in the output as well, which forced the Syrian government of those years to buy more food from abroad, which dipped into coffers which were already thin. As a result, in that period right before the Arab Spring, about 1.5 million migrated from rural to urban areas, and it had been continuing, like I said, from the late 60s or from the 70s on, but it really accelerated. So that when the conflicts in the urban areas started, it really spread quickly. Assad was unable to really stop that conflict. Really, it was the military had the only tool available was to start firing on protesters. Several military soldiers and officers left the army, formed the Syrian Free Army as an opposition group. And really, this is where we start seeing it in 2012 really take off. Chemical weapons were used. As we go down the line, we see in 2014 the rise of ISIS. Actually, ISIS was rising before that. It was nascent in the mid 2000s. Wasn't until 2010 that they actually gained momentum, and this was due to the sort of de-Baathization from Iraqi forces from the U.S. invasion in 2003. Instead of maintaining the army, it was the Iraqi army was completely collapsed, and officers were sort of sent packing. That left a capable, trained military force looking for something to do, and that was really the core of ISIS. But not to get too far into it. This article, Assad is here to stay, is revealing where we are today now, and we'll return with your questions to kind of reveal what some of the tensions are now as we see leaders now faced with decisions about what to do about maintaining security in the Middle East. And so when we talk about the Gulf leaders have their security concerns. The rest of the Middle East have slightly different concerns, but nonetheless, what we're seeing is this is as a result of a withdrawal of U.S. influence in the region. This is a withdrawal of U.S. policymaking that puts the Middle East foremost. In the recent strategic documents, we're seeing a shift to China rather than to the Middle East. So that the result of that are that Arab states are taking their own security on their own and making decisions, purchasing weapons, making security agreements with their neighbors, which is ironically what the United States has wanted them to do for 2 decades. Okay, so I want to switch gears real quick to stay on track and talk quickly about the state of Syria being really a client state in some ways. There's through the Syrian civil war, as it started to go bad after the United States entered to fight ISIS in 2014, the Assad regime was in a lot of trouble. They were broke. They couldn't control their territory. ISIS was growing and taking a fair bit of territory. So show you a slide real quick. In this, if we see this slide of this is the 2017, this is where things were when they were on the retreat. If we go back in time, we can see here that the greatest extent in May of 2015, this whole gray area that you're seeing on the map is ISIS-controlled area. And these were government forces here in the red. These are Free Syrian and Turkish forces up here in the yellow. Free Syrian Army is in the green. You could see the leverage that they had and as it bleeds into Iraq. And it was during this time that the Russians entered Syria. Why would Russia go to Syria? Well, there's a long history that the Russians and actually the Soviet Union had with with Syria. It really, when we talk about the Soviet Union, we do mean the accommodation of Hafiz al-Assad, the current president's father, as far as equipping the army, buying weapons, but this was a accommodation for the Soviet Navy. The Soviet Navy needed not just a place, a port on the Eastern Med, which is what Syria was able to give them, but it gave them great control against the US Sixth Fleet, the US fleet in the Mediterranean. That fleet was always a problem for the Soviet Navy, which of course had to come into the Med through the Black Sea. And that would be one of the major centers of gravity in that region that the Soviet Navy had to face. So it wasn't just a port, it was actual support from Syria that the Soviet Navy got at the time out here in the East. Okay, so as those backgrounds politically change, we see there's a long history that Russia has in Syria. But again, like I said, Bashar al-Assad is was not his father. And this was an opportunity in a lot of ways for the Russians to sort of eat his lunch. Essentially capitalizing on the fact he was a weak leader. At the same time, Iran is a resurgent Iran, now belligerent, was using Syria more or less as a client to funnel arms and weapons and support to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a Shia-backed opposition group, against Israel and keeping control in Lebanon. So these two articles that I have from Al Jazeera, which are showing that Assad himself is, of course, is Putin's puppet, offering support for the invasion of Ukraine, and at the same time we have Syrians, in the grassroots who are actually standing by Ukraine, in this, because they have seen the Russians up close, they have seen what they have done in their own country, and they are ready to support them in, against the Russians. So there's not just an analog, but a clear parallel to what we've seen of how the Russians have occupied and the military operations in Syria, and how that has unfolded in Ukraine. I'll just caveat that with they're not the same forces. It was mostly air power in Syria, and it's mostly a land battle in Ukraine right now, mostly land. Almost no air power whatsoever is being used in Ukraine. Maybe that'll change soon. All right, so I move on. So those articles discussed that dichotomy. Bashar al-Assad's power base is really in the populated centers of the country in the middle. And as we look right here, this is how it looks today. As we see that the Syrian government has taken back a lot of terrain, a lot of what was lost here. If you go back to the 2017 map, lost control here, as you can see, the ISIS dominant areas here. This was when they were already on the withdrawal. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the leader of ISIS, would be killed here in 2 more years, but you can see how things flowed over time. Right now, they've retaken a lot. Raqqa here, this is what used to be the center of ISIS. It's also the location of the recent prison break back in January by ISIS. And you can see right here, this is an area under control by the Syrian Democratic Forces. I want to point out that Syria is a stew pot of different ethnicities. It is not just I can't say that it is a Muslim country. I mean, it is by majority population, if you would say what's the dominant religion, it's Islam. But I want to point out that it is a secular country. And Bashar al-Assad himself is actually an Alawi. So within Syria, you have Sunnis, Christians, Alawites, Druze, Ismailis, Mandeans, Shiites, Salafis, and Yazidis. And that is because it's a very old country with a lot of old communities. Assad, who is an Alawite, Alawites sort of align with the Shia, but they're not necessarily, they're not Shia. And some would not even consider them, Islamic. And that's sort of open. But as a result, he uses those ethnic tensions in the country to maintain control. And that's how he's able to maintain stability. And I'll point out that one of the article here is talking about, I think it's the last one, the Economist article, talking about whether, he's got an election coming up. yes, he did actually win that election 6 months ago or so by an overwhelming majority. And I'll just point out that that's because not everyone in Syria is allowed to vote, only his power base. And you can see where he's concentrated his power. It's there up along the coast. That's where the Alawites are from. You have the Sunnis. It is actually a Sunni majority country, but it is not run with the traditional Sunni politics like you see Sunni Shia confrontations like you see in Iraq. So I'll leave it at that. And then, of course, this Wall Street Journal article, which I apologize, had a couple of errors in the formatting. That's what happens when you steal an article from online and send it to your friends. I had a little formatting problem, but I think you were able to get through most of it. Talking about the comeback that everyone thought ISIS was dead. And that was the party line in 2019 when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. Then that was the end of ISIS, which ultimately they lost their caliphate. And the caliphate in the Islamic tradition requires territory. When they lost that, essentially they lost their power. But they had enough cash, and I think we saw that in this Wall Street article, to keep a warm start. And that's what they tried to do. They tried to make that prison break in Raqqa. This is actually something that ISIS does to gain members. Back in 2010, they staged an enormous prison break, and really that's probably where they began their rise to power, because as a result of that manpower, and of course, ISIS itself is a tremendous discussion. We can't even get into in the time. We can cover some topics with that. The last article, of course, was from The Economist, and after 10 years of war, have broken Syria into pieces. And the whole point of this article, why I was offering this to the group, is because of the economic problems. And like I talked about, the economic problems which stem from a 3-year drought, which exacerbated the political problem on the ground in Syria, leading to the tensions after the Arab Spring, which launched the Syrian civil war. These continue. The same economic problems. There's still droughts. There's still people leaving the agricultural sector, and ultimately it's feeding this continuous problem. I will want to point out that on page 3 of the where the map is, we talk about Syrian economy is in worse shape than any other time in the past. Assad's economy can afford to pay civil servants only $15 a month. Something you probably need to know about the Arab economy, and then I'm going to break here real quick, is that most jobs in the Arab economy are state jobs, not just in Syria. This is most jobs are state. The education system is primarily geared to train people to work in the public sector. Let me just go ahead and stop my share here. And then, like teachers, bureaucrats, administrators, public works, utilities, infrastructure, infrastructure construction, even factories and manufacturing can belong to the state. And certainly in Egypt, it's rife with that. As a result, you have very little foreign direct investment. You have a workforce that's not trained to take on high-tech jobs or big manufacturing, because no one's going to invest, no foreign company is going to invest in a country that does not have workers who are skilled in modern manufacturing techniques or in high-tech applications. As a result, since there's no money in the system, there's not enough money to rebuild the education system. So you have a brain drain as well. That's systematic. It's systemic in the entire Arab world for the most part, except for the very rich ones, because that's where they're draining to. They go to Saudi and UAE to find lucrative jobs working to fill the sectors that they lack, like medicine and law and management. Okay, so that is my thumbnail sketch of Syria today. If we can open up the floor, Mike, and try to use our time as best we can. I think we had a little bit of Russian cyber interference there.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much, Frank, for your insightful comments. Every time I try to wrap my head around Syria, I'm just reminded about all the nuances and the complexity. So to hear you try to really summarize all of that in such a short amount of time, it really is impressive, and certainly you leave us with some great insights this evening. As Frank mentioned, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll be happy to pass along some questions. I will also say that because of some of the technical difficulties we had in the beginning, we'll be happy to stay on the line here a little bit after 7 p.m. So we'll be sure to get to as many as possible. Maybe just to get the conversation started, Frank, though, I was wondering if maybe I could toss you a couple of questions just to get your reaction. So, the overview of Syrian politics and the Syrian civil war that you give us, you mentioned quite a few actors, whether the Assad regime, whether Russia, whether ISIS. You mentioned some of the, the sort of the other fighting forces on the ground. But taking a look in 2022, who are the main actors that are relevant in Syria today, and what are really their goals that they have?
Well, I think Russia remains a main patron of the Assad regime, so they're a main actor. Let me just cover it real quick. We do have Turkey. They have a very fundamental interest in Syria. And before the Arab Spring, I want to point out that in 09-10, Turkey was trading heavily with Syria. There was a lot of good cross-border trade. The economy was doing well. And if you remember, Turkey has been wanting to join the EU. That's as a result of some of that trade. The economy was very good. And after the start of the war, Turkey has had to pull out of that and had to manage all of the refugee flows, all the migrant flows that are coming across the border. If you hear the name Idlib all the time, Idlib is the location on the northwest corner of Syria that's right on the Turkish border. And that's where all the refugees get stopped up. And Turkey has used the refugees against the European Union as sort of a weapon. Additionally, the United States does stay committed. We have not departed. In fact, we remain, U.S. policy still remains focused on expanding the humanitarian access to Syria and to care for the refugees there, as well as to suppress ISIS. But mostly it's about the humanitarian crisis that's there as well. Iraq, of course, on its border is really, it's in a counterterrorism role, anti-crime role, and they're watching their border crossing there. As well as Iran. Iran is fundamentally an important actor in Syria because of their accommodation with Hezbollah and the sort of Shia connection. Broadly, let me just take another 50,000-foot view. We'll go up to altitude a little bit and look down. If you look at that whole region, it's something called the Shia Crescent, and going from Lebanon through Syria, Iran down into Yemen, that forms a crescent of power projection that Iran wants to put onto the Gulf region and the greater Middle East to maintain a regional hegemony.
Thank you so much. And maybe to ask a follow-up question that speaks a bit to the theme of our discussion this evening. I loved how you situated your remarks by referring to specific news articles. And I'm wondering maybe from that perspective, if you can comment on why it is that you think Syria, for all that's going on, has fallen out of the news. And maybe give some advice for those of us who want to follow what's going on in Syria today. What are those sources that you would recommend we look at in order to really keep up with current events?
I think, Mike, great question, really great question. I think that the news cycle really can't handle digesting the events in Syria in an easily communicatable way, because it doesn't reflect what U.S. policy is doing. And so if it doesn't directly affect what the U.S. is trying to achieve, because honestly, Syria does have little influence on the United States directly, I think that's why it's not in the news cycle, which is why we're talking about it today. But it remains important for maybe many reasons, fundamentally because of the humanitarian crisis and failed statism. And the failed statism is, if I have a country on my border, my neighbor, fails in some way, the economy collapses, I'm going to get all of the refugees into my country. So it's my interest as well. And as a result, we've seen this, those refugees go into Europe. Now, I think as a result, it gets watered down. So either the Syrian civil war continues on without any resolution in the future. I think that viewers probably have lost interest in it. Now, as a result, as we look at the whole Middle East, and I talked about all the Arab partners out there, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, they are taking control of their own state security, their own missile defense against Iran. And that is why it should be more important to us, because that remains a power base. Russia is filling in the gaps where the US power recedes. They're not filling in everywhere. They're being very careful because they don't have the same resources, but they are influential in certain ways, and they play the information war a lot better than we do. And this goes back to Russia protecting, why are they there? They're protecting the soft underbelly of Russia. This goes back to Catherine the Great, who said the best way to defend your borders is to expand them. And that's why Russia has had a long-term presence in the Middle East through either conflict with Turkey, conflict with Iran, or in Syria.
Excellent, thank you so much. And it looks like we're getting quite a few questions from the audience. So I think for now, I'll skip over to those. And for those who are following along, I'll try to answer them in the order in which they're received. First question we have is, can you comment on or discuss the clash that's going on right now with Russian mercenaries?
Okay, so the yeah, they have Russia has been using what we call military contractors, PMCs, private military contractors, and there's one there's one main contractor they use. What I will comment on is this is a way for Putin to exercise military force on the cheap. He is reluctant to use Russian soldiers because of the cost that comes from not just supporting the soldiers in the field and their operations, but also the negative press that Putin will get from the deaths of actual Russian soldiers. So these private military contractors have been used in Syria. They've been used in other places as well, but in Syria primarily to sort of avoid the political problem that Putin has. Yes, even an autocrat like Vladimir Putin has to still placate his electorate to some degree. In addition, it's not just his direct representation to his electorate. He has a cohort of oligarchs who depend on him. He's sort of the person in place. The oligarchs would eventually replace him if he could not deliver. So we'll tell you that in 2020, 2019, I believe, somewhere around there, we did have a conflict with US forces firing on PMCs from the Wagner Group, which is their prime military contractor. And as a result, there was no, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And as a result, there was no fallout between Russia and the United States. There was no law of war conflict there. That's what the most unusual thing is about that.
Excellent, thank you so much. The next question we have is from Kathy, who actually spent some time in Syria back in the 1990s. And when there noticed that women played an active role in the government, and she's wondering today, what's the status of women in Syria to the extent that it might be summarized maybe from a 45,000 foot level? What would be the status of women that you see in Syria today?
Well, now that's interesting. So there is, like a lot of Arab countries, like I saw in Morocco as well, it's a dichotomy in that in the urban centers, it's a more cosmopolitan. And so in Syria, you have a workforce that, again, a secular run country, that it brings women into the workforce. But you will see in the rural areas that traditional role where it's, women and girls do not have the same opportunities. Now, it's not as bad as in a lot of other places, but I will say that it depends on the ethno-religious background. And like I said, Syria is a quilt of different ethnicities and religions. And so, like I said, majority Sunni country, however, as well as Christians and Druze, which is another sort of branch of Shia, they have different histories. And so they have different treatment of women. But I would say that women and children broadly in Syria are in trouble. They can't get enough food. There's not enough money in the system, and there's very few opportunities. As a result, we have a population explosion of young people and no opportunities to give them for employment or even any sort of self-betterment. What is that bulge of youth going to do when it gets, of age, which is any time now? They're going to have no opportunities looking at conflicts, combat, crime, or just to be poor and living on government handouts. And so women are part of this system where mothers are central to the family unit. And if there's just no opportunities, there's nothing they can do except stay in this sort of traditional role. I hope that clarifies it.
Yes, I definitely think so. Absolutely. Thank you so much. The next question we have seems to really be referring to the sort of the state of hostilities today. Would you say that in terms of ongoing hostilities, things have settled down a bit? And then maybe more specifically, do citizens seem more compliant to Assad's wishes and policies?
Well, I think that I'm gonna tell you straight that in just my opinion, that Assad has been able to sort of subdue, I wouldn't say even placate, he's been able to subdue the population now due to either imprisoning them or killing them. And so many people have died in the civil war. And he's retaken those areas. When it was earlier in the civil war, a lot more things were moving. The Free Syrian Army was there. The SDF had movement. Turkey was more involved in a kinetic fashion, tanks moving. I think things were a little freer, and Assad was on the move. The big game changer was Russia. Russia is not advising, they are dropping bombs. They are leveling entire neighborhoods with their fighter and bomber aircraft. Before the Russians were there, it was Assad dropping barrel bombs from helicopters, which is not a precision weapon. After the Russians got there, they institutionalized the war machine and was able to consolidate gains for Assad. And I think we really are looking at that being the big change to pacify the civilian population. As a result, there's also few opportunities to do anything but rely on the government for support, because the problem in Idlib has kept migratory flows and immigration shut at the Turkish border. So I think that might be leading to some of the problems.
And I really appreciate how in your last response to that question, and then throughout your remarks tonight, you've really situated Syria in a broader regional and international context. So whether that's talking about Russia, whether that's talking about Turkey. A question that we have from the audience asks, what about Lebanon? And how does the instability that we see currently in Lebanon affect Syria? How does it spill over? And maybe to the extent that you're able to comment, is there anything positive that you see on the horizon for Lebanon?
Well, great question, Mike, and thank you to the audience for that question. I'd like to say often about looking at a country or a problem in the Middle East. You can't shine a flashlight on a place in the Middle East without the light reflecting on other places. And as you can see, all of that is interconnected. Lebanon is, I think, if I had a worse nightmare developed in a laboratory to just frighten me all the time, that would be Lebanon. Now, Lebanon, of course, was part of the Syrian lands before the mandatory countries that emerged out of Sykes-Picot following World War I, that the Allied powers put together for administration of the former Ottoman lands. And so Syria and Iraq and Palestine, they were all sort of communities that existed without borders, without they had governors, but they were not hard borders like they are now. Now, that's an academic question about what Sykes-Picot means 100 years on, but I will just say that Lebanon, as a result, had a very unique and problematic structure that is different than every other country in the Middle East. The president, there are three principal ethnic groups in Lebanon. You have the Christians, you have Sunnis, and you have Shias. And as a result, because of the conflicts that always have continued forever in that area, the government is broken up by the president is a Christian, there is a prime minister who is a Shia, and then you have a council of ministers, I believe it's called, that are your Sunni. So essentially, when you vote in an election, if you're Christian, you're always voting for the president. If you are a Shia, you are going to vote for the prime minister. And all of that goes according to the place that you're born and the place that and the thing that Americans need to understand about the Middle East is your last name, your family name belongs to a place in that country. And as long as you live, you're always going to be known from a village. And that ties you to a region. And in a place like Lebanon, that's how they vote. So there's never a change in the political structure. As a result, you go back to 2006, 2005 actually, the death of the Prime Minister Hariri, that was blamed on Syria. Syria was trying to assert control over Lebanon, and your astute audience by knowing that, that they're largely blamed for that assassination. And as a result, why are they interested in doing that? Now they are trying to assert control for Hezbollah to become more than just an opposition group, right? They're a political party. There's a military wing, there's a political wing. And when they can control Lebanon, that is controlling, Hezbollah is able to influence, violent effects on Israel and maintain control in Lebanon. Does Bashar al-Assad have an effect on Lebanon? He has some effect, but Lebanon is its own thing. And honestly, I think you need to start from scratch to with a new country. It's in real trouble.
Can I maybe ask a follow-up question there and ask about the effect in the reverse? What about the impact that Lebanon has and the instability in Lebanon and Syria today?
Well, again, back to failed statism. If you look at what the response should have been from the Syrians after the giant port explosion about a year and a half ago, that leveled quite a bit of the city, that there was not a change of government. This is an opportunity for maybe the Assad regime to go in and try to do some statecraft, because really the same problems that created the explosion in the first place, with storing these fertilizers and these toxic chemicals in this warehouse that I think it was for about more than 10 years they were in this warehouse, festering without government, without Lebanese government action. It didn't change. A year on, they were still sort of pointing fingers at each other and barely into the reconstruction. So I do not think that Syria sees Lebanon in its interest to manage the government. The political problem, because of the tripartite structure, is difficult. But I would see Syria to be involved, in Lebanon to just maintain control and maybe get more port access. As far as it going the other way, I don't see them really being kindred spirits. And again, although it was one area, they're different ethnicities, and so they see the problems differently.
Great, thank you. An ethnic group that you haven't really talked as much about yet is the Kurds. And I can remember a few years ago when it made huge headlines here in the United States when the US withdrew direct support for the Kurds. What is the status of the Kurds today, and what is their role in developments in Syria in 2022? Yeah,
that's great. I'm glad you asked about that, because that is one of the main groups in Syria and in the entire Levant. I should have brought that up, so thank you for catching me and calling me out on it. Kurds are a important group. So the Kurds, which exist in northern Iraq and in eastern Turkey and in the eastern part of Syria, basically, they are part of the fabric of that area. And although Kurds are not Arabs, they share the land with everyone that's there. Now, Iraq has a different perspective on the Kurds. They're not Iraqi. I mean, they're not Arabs, right? So they don't have that same ethnic alignment. But it's different in Turkey. Turkey fundamentally sees the Kurds as a threat to the Turkish government. The PKK, which is the Kurdish Workers' Party, has been it's not just an opposition group. It's a armed guerrilla group that has been working against the Turkish government. They have practiced violent acts, and so they are actually I believe the United States has labeled them as a violent terrorist group. However, war makes strange bedfellows, and when you look at the structure of the opposition groups, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, was a U.S. partner in the fight against ISIS, and was made up of a lot of groups, and the one largest group were the Kurds. And the SDF leadership, the U.S. recognized the SDF without recognizing that the PKK was actually in the leadership of the SDFs, and so it's splitting hairs. I think the Kurds have an important role in the history of that region, in that sort of northern Iraq, Syria area, and they have been fighting for recognition. They are in the oil-rich areas of Iraq, and they want to take part. They want to reap the benefits of having mineral riches in their own backyard. But this has been a continuing problem with the federalization of the Iraqi government and the oppression by the Turkish government, which has lasted decades.
And Frank, I hope you'll forgive me. I do want to ask a question that I know violates one of the key things that we are that we should know about the Middle East, which is that there's one country is very different than the next. The entire region is not homogenous. You can't paint the entire region with a broad brush. But I do want to take advantage of the breadth of experience that you bring to this discussion and ask you if, from a comparative perspective, is the civil war in Syria and is the current political climate in Syria, does it remind you of another conflict, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world?
Well, it's unique when you think that the Syrian civil war started from some kids putting graffiti on the wall. But I'll take the bait, because the systemic problems that created the outcome are the same in most places in the Middle East. And they have a real problem with governance. I think fundamentally, governance is a real problem, because they're going to have economic tensions. There are resource constraints. Water is very difficult to get, keep clean, and distribute. And then, of course, arable land is difficult. And the education systems are in trouble. But that could all be fixed if there was a proper governance. And I think that is why we see so much authoritarianism. Remember, after the Arab Spring occurred in Egypt, and the Hosni Mubarak, who had been a dictator for decades there, was ousted, they brought in a reformer. Now, it was a Muslim Brotherhood member, which, if you don't know, has a tremendous negative baggage in Arab contexts. But nonetheless, the Muslim Brotherhood had existed since the 1920s as a political party in a place where there are no political parties. They were the only ones who could mobilize and get the word out. What happened after just 2 years of Mohamed Morsi, after just a short time? Well, it was a military coup. And General Sisi came in. And I think if you ask the average Egyptian on the street, that's what they want. They like that strongman to come in and stop that uncertainty. And as far as governance goes, these are some of the pressures that you're going to have. There's a lack of accountability of their own leaders to address these problems. So I think if you see that in Bashar al-Assad, you're going to see that with Hosni Mubarak and Sisi. You're going to see that across the Middle East, unfortunately.
Yeah, as someone who studies the Middle East myself, I can confirm that what you're saying is all too true. Maybe a fun question for you. We're going to have our president tonight giving the State of the Union address. Certainly, there is a lot on the plates. Certainly, when it comes to foreign affairs, there are probably headlines that the president's going to be focusing on before Syria. But if you had the president's ear and could give him one piece of advice with regard to Syria, what would it be?
Great question. Wow. If I had the opportunity to talk to President Biden about this, I would say, don't leave the Middle East behind. Don't look at it in the lens of either conflict or terrorism. Look at the possibilities for cooperation that exist there. The Arab societies are old. They're very traditional, but there are some great partnerships that we we've had on the governmental level, and working with other military forces. You know, I don't go in the room with my foreign counterparts and say, I'm from the United States, I'm here to show you how it's done, and open my bag of money. What I do is I say, I'm here from the United States. Let's see what we can do together. Let's have an information transfer. Now, unfortunately, we put a lot of people in those positions that are not educated on how to do security cooperation. And we think that money equals security cooperation when it really requires a lot of time. So I would ask President Biden, put your feet in the Middle East. I mean, figuratively, of course, and spend some time there and look at the lens of not just our vital national interests only in energy or in terrorism, but let's see what we can do, because our lack of presence there is actually creating a bigger humanitarian crisis. And if the Biden administration is going to stand by their words in the national security strategic guidance, that human rights is a fundamentally important part. And rather than taking a realist posture in that strategic document, in that strategic guidance, he's taken one that's more about shared values. And shared values is not realism. Shared values is a different way to go for a government, and it's difficult. But I think there's a reward that's available in the Middle East.
And we're getting close to the end of our time, so I'll invite our audience to offer any additional questions that they might have. We might be able to have time for one or two more, if that's okay with you, Frank.
Oh yeah, I'm here.
So one question, and you've touched on this a little bit in talking about the youth bulge in Syria. You've talked a little bit about agriculture. You've talked a little bit about the state-centric economy, but our audience is curious to know about, just in general, how would you paint a picture of the economic challenges that exist in Syria today? And is there any role that the U.S. can play in helping alleviate those?
Well, okay, so I think that oil is a curse, is what we talk about the oil economy in the Middle East. And many countries in the Middle East are rentier states, which means that the state earns money from selling the minerals under their feet. And in this case, they be predominantly oil. When the oil runs out, Syria will not be the only country that will be in trouble, that will not be able to make money by selling that oil anymore. And so skills and a vibrant economy and farming and agriculture, that's going to be important everywhere. And right now, maybe we have those opportunities with Syria. Nothing is really going to change while Bashar al-Assad is there. Now, I'm hoping maybe a big thaw will occur with the Arab neighbors there in the region reaching out to Assad and trying to change him. The Arab League is reinstating Syria as well to be a normal member. And the role for U.S. policy right now, I'll just echo what Secretary Blinken said about it, is that we're going to focus on expanding humanitarian access to Syria, sustaining the campaign against ISIS, and making clear the U.S. commitment to demand Assad's accountability. And so if you want to get in and get a transformational change, it's going to have to be to face that governance problem, because I really do think that as long as we stick to the way we've been doing things, that we prop up strongmen, whether or not we agree with them, that favor U.S. policy, just to sort of get our policy across the finish line, we're going to continue to exacerbate or feed into the systemic problems of the Middle East. And I think a lot of people want to work with the United States on that. The problem is it gets boiled down to money and contracts and Mr. 10% and who gets a piece of the action. And that's all transactional, which is the corruption that exists at every level of every government. So.
Well, I should say, Frank, that you've left us with a lot of perhaps more questions than answers. I mean, whenever you start unpacking Syria, it really starts to, the complexity and the nuance just unravels very quickly. I'll invite Matthew to come back on in a couple of minutes, but maybe, Frank, if I could just toss out one last question.
Sure.
You've given us, sorry, Matthew, you've given us so much to chew on, and I think so much to reflect on when it comes to Syria in 2022. What one news source would you recommend that we follow up on, given that Syria isn't quite always in the headlines here in the United States? What one news source would you recommend that we refer to just to keep up to date with what's going on?
Ultimately, it's a hybrid system that you put right here. So here's what I do is I read at least 3 newspapers every day, at least 3. So I'm going to read Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. I'm going to read the Arab press. I'm going to read Al Jazeera. And then I'll read it in English. I'll also read it in Arabic. And I'll look to other sources. And here's my theory. I worked in public relations in Chicago in the late 90s. I was, and that's what the influence told me, is understanding how, as in the PR shop, in the PR firm, is influencing the message. You have to go to different sources and level it out. And there's not one source to do it. And you cannot just rely on newspapers or magazines. The Economist is another great source. So what I teach my students about information and about analysis is newspapers are what's going on right now, and they tend to be wrong because we don't really know what happened until we look at the long history. So that's what books and peer-reviewed journal articles are good for. And so in the middle, you look for these maybe weekly newspapers like the Economist, which I have a lot of respect for. But I wouldn't just go right to BBC and read that and think that that's good news. And also I read the London Times as well, because they're 6-7 hours ahead of me, and I'm going to read to see what just happened, in the future. So that's my recommendation to you. You really need to put at least 3 sources to digest, and stay away from 24-hour news unless you're watching something that's like literally on fire right now, because I think they just sell eyeballs and they sell time, and they don't really cover issues. They just sell time. That's just my opinion.
I think that's wonderful advice. Frank, I'll be the first to thank you for your insights this evening. It was a wonderful conversation. Matthew, now I will turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Mike and Frank, thank you so much. And Frank, I just want to pick up on that last point that you made. Being informed and being thoughtfully informed is an act of intentionality, right? This is not something that happens by accident. This is not something that happens with what we happen to pick up in the world around us, right? We really have to seek out the information's out there, right? And it's about making that part of your daily diet. So I really appreciate that point, Frank. And thank you so much for your insights and perspectives tonight. Mike, thank you for your moderating, and everybody on Zoom with us tonight. Thank you for sticking through some Zoom technical difficulties. We are used to that now in this world. We're also excited to get back to some in-person programming in the coming weeks. So if you've not seen those announcements, please visit us online at irckc.org. There you can see our full calendar of events, as well as how to become a member and other ways to get involved with the international community here in Kansas City or wherever you might be. So thanks so much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. And until we see you again, please be safe and take care. Thanks so much.